In 1972, a group of eminent scientists sat down to write a letter to the President of the United States. They were frightened. The Earth's climate seemed to be going haywire. They worried that war, pestilence and famine were on the way. For the first time, climate change had become a hot political topic. The letter warned the President he had to prepare not for global warming, but for the complete opposite, a new ice age. Yep, 36 years ago, a lot of leading scientists really thought that an ice age was just around the corner. And yet today, they're all apparently convinced that global warming is the big threat. But if scientists were so wrong back then, how can we be sure they've got it right today? In this series, I'm going to explore some simple big questions. How do we know the climate's warming up?
Oh my God.
How do we know humans are causing it? And how do we know what's going to happen next?
No!
As the story of global warming has unfolded, we've learned about the very nature of scientific truth, and about how that has been falsified, manipulated, twisted, and even bought.
As close to scientific fraud as you can get.
This is the story of how science discovered global warming. Perhaps the greatest challenge we've ever faced.
Whoa!
Yes!
That was a bumpy landing.
Oh. This is me, Ian Stewart, geologist and lecturer at Plymouth University.
Oh, look. Get the crystals.
Oh, we don't want to know.
But I'm also a husband and a dad, so I've got a professional and a personal interest in global warming.
That's the limestone.
I don't care.
And that there's a sandstone.
I don't care.
And that is like, you don't care. You know, the kids tease me that geology is just boring old rocks. And what they don't get, well, not yet at least, is that it's really about how the planet works. And I don't think you can be interested in that and not be worried about what kind of future they're in for.
I'm used to studying how the planet changes over millions of years. The gradual wearing down of cliffs by the sea. The remorseless drift of the continents. The slow building of mountains.
The idea that something is happening that could fundamentally change the planet within my kids' lifetimes is extraordinary and actually quite frightening.
But there's another reason why I'm fascinated by the scientific discovery of global warming. It's a story where many of the key developments fit into my own lifetime. It begins back in the 1970s, when I was just a little kid. The way I remember, pretty well everything was depressing in the 70s. The haircuts were dodgy, the films were mostly disaster movies. And Britain was in a state of near anarchy. Everything was falling apart, including the planet.
Earth was running out of resources. Acid rain was killing the lakes and forests. Overpopulation was going to lead to mass starvation. This was a time of ecological doom-mongering on an epic scale.
Harriet, look at this. Just about everyone we know is a polluter.
You had to ask me now what the chances are of civilization reaching the turn of the century. I'd have to say 1 or 2% if we're lucky.
And there was one more scare story, the threat of a new ice age. In 1974, this major BBC documentary explored the conviction of some scientists that ice was on the march.
Besides the risk of somewhat cooler weather in the decades ahead, there's the ever-present threat of a big freeze.
We should be preparing ourselves for a long period of mainly colder seasons.
Already, the Russians are building icebreakers as fast as they can.
Will a new ice age claim our lands and bury our northern cities?
Unless we learn otherwise, it will be prudent to suppose that the next ice age could begin to bite at any time.
It didn't quite turn out like that, did it? I mean, the world didn't end. And you have to say that in the 1970s, the environmentalists were wide of the mark on quite a few counts. When it comes to the question of the next ice age, even the scientists got it wrong. But that doesn't mean to say that the science was bad.
This is KTE 361, Unit 221. We are pulling up here.
For years, climate scientists had been doing what scientists do. Gathering data, collating it, analysing it. And they'd noticed something. The planet was cooling down. In the 1960s, Britain shivered as a succession of bitter winters followed one after another.
A barrier of snow on one main road defied even the snowplows. Squads of workmen had to tackle it the hard way.
It wasn't just Britain. Scientists had linked together weather reports from around the world, and it seemed clear Britain's cold winters were part of a global trend. And there was a theory to explain why the Earth was cooling. Because this was the era of King Coal. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the world economy boomed. Power stations poured smoke into the air. And before global warming came along, burning fossil fuel was responsible for a very different climate scare story. Global cooling. A drop in temperature large enough to cause a new ice age. But how could pollution lead to cooling? The theory was simple. Smoke from power station chimneys formed a layer of sooty particles in the atmosphere. These particles blocked some of the sun's rays from reaching the Earth, leading to a slightly dimmer and therefore cooler planet. It seemed to make perfect sense. Some of the brightest young scientists of the day signed up to the new theory. One of them was Steve Schneider. In a famous paper in 1971, he said that global temperatures could decrease by over 3 degrees. And he pointed out that if this happened, it could be enough to trigger a new ice age. It all seemed to fit together. The climate was cooling and there was a theory to explain why. But it didn't last. There's a saying in science along the lines of, there's nothing so sad as a beautiful theory destroyed by an ugly fact. And in 1976, along came an ugly fact. The summer of 1976 broke all records.
Blazing heath and woodland fires have destroyed hundreds of acres of Surrey in the last 2 days.
If water isn't saved in the home, jobs will be affected.
As it happens, I remember the summer of 1976 really well. I was 12 and I was on a family holiday to Clondudno. And I remember it for two reasons. One was my brother got pooed on by a seagull. Still makes me chuckle, that. But the second was, it was just so damn hot. And not just here. Across the world, 30 years of cooling came to an abrupt end. The planet began to warm up. And as the warming trend strengthened, it became clear that the science behind the Ice Age theory was flawed. For the scientists who had been associated with the coming Ice Age, it was a chastening experience.
Well, nobody likes to be wrong. But remember, I never said, I predict that we're going to induce an ice age. What I said was, under these assumptions, this is what you get. Other scientists say that could trigger an ice age.
You know, it's easy to criticise Schneider, but to me, there was nothing wrong in what he did. This is how science works. You've got a theory, you look for evidence. If the evidence doesn't fit, you change the theory. The Ice Age theory was based on what was known at the time. When new data came in, Schneider changed his mind. I think he deserves a bit of credit for that. With cooling off the agenda, the question now was very different. Why was the planet warming up? For many years, a group of scientists had been working on an alternative theory about what was happening to the climate. Now, their time had come. The roots of this alternative theory lay with an obsessional genius by the name of Dave Keeling. If the scientific discovery of global warming has a hero, then Keeling is probably it. In 1956, a young Dave Keeling arrived here at San Diego's premier academic institution, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Keeling had a simple desire, to be outside, preferably in wild and beautiful places. It's not unlike the reason that I took up geology. The difference is that, unlike me, Keeling turned into a genuine scientific hero. As a kid, Keeling put together a lovingly crafted scrapbook of photographs from around the world that inspired him. Now, as a researcher, he looked for a way to combine his love of science with his love of the outdoors. And in the late 1950s, he found it. He would focus on a problem that scientists were just beginning to worry about, measuring the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Studying carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere had little to commend itself to an ambitious young scientist. But Keeling didn't care. He got the chance to throw his sleeping bag into the back of